My name is Patricia Sinclair. I am 64 years old, and for more than 3 decades, I worked as a librarian in Hudson, New York. Most people think libraries are quiet places, but I learned early that silence can carry warnings long before anyone speaks them out loud. Maybe that is why, when the first strange feeling settled in my home, I heard it before I understood it. And if you stay with me, you'll know exactly why I pretended to visit my sister, why an elderly neighbor whispered the words, "Wait until midnight," and what I finally saw when the clock struck 12. Before I begin, if stories like mine mean something to you, feel free to follow this channel so we can keep walking through these moments together. I always believed that a house remembers the people who loved it. Mine certainly did. It held the sound of my husband's laugh in the kitchen, the warm smell of his coffee drifting down the hallway, the way he whispered the word home as if it were a promise. After he passed, the house felt softer, as though it was trying to comfort me, carrying his memories in gentle pieces. I spent mornings pulling weeds in the garden, afternoons reading by the window, nights listening to the creak of the old beams settling in the cold air. It was ordinary, but it was mine. When my son Aaron asked if he and his wife Melissa could stay for a while, I didn't hesitate. I told them the front bedroom was already made up. They arrived with boxes stacked high, their car loaded all the way to the roof. I rushed outside to help, smiling because that is what mothers do, even when their children are grown. For a moment, the driveway felt alive again, like the old days when Aaron was small and running in circles with a superhero cape dragging behind him. But something was off. I noticed it the second they stepped inside. Their smiles seemed fixed in place. Too polite, too careful. The house didn't shift into its familiar warmth. Instead, it felt as if someone had turned the air down a few degrees. I brushed the feeling aside, refusing to be the kind of mother who imagines drama where there is none. After all, people get tired. People get stressed. I told myself that was all. The first week passed quietly, too quietly. I would walk into a room and the conversation would cut off mid-sentence. Drawers I rarely used were slightly open. A door that had been shut would be ajar. It was never anything large enough to point at, nothing I could present as proof. Only impressions, only atmosphere, only that small tightening in my stomach, the one I tried to ignore each time it returned. One afternoon, I reached into the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I was looking for a small embroidered cloth, something Aaron had made for me in second grade. The stitches were crooked, the colors mismatched, but it was precious. I kept it folded beneath my old sweaters so the scent of cedar would cling to it. But when I lifted the sweaters that day, the cloth was gone. Not misplaced, gone. I stood there with my hand still in the chest, waiting for a memory to arrive, waiting to remember if I had moved it. The memory never came. My heart thudded once, twice, the way it does when something inside you shifts. I closed the chest slowly. I couldn't explain why that missing cloth mattered more than anything else I had noticed. It was just a small thing made by a small boy decades ago. But the absence of it felt like someone had reached into my past and rearranged it without permission. That night over dinner, I asked casually whether either of them had been in my room. Melissa looked up quickly, smiled, and said, "No, of course not." Aaron kept eating with his head down, the fork scraping lightly against the plate. The sound grated through the room. I felt my breath grow shallow, as if something dark had brushed across my shoulder. Later that week, I returned home from the grocery store and stepped inside. The house felt wrong, quieter than usual, hollowed out somehow. I set the bags on the counter and walked through each room, trying to pinpoint the source of the discomfort. But everything looked ordinary. All I could hear was the faint hum of the refrigerator and my own heartbeat in my ears. That evening, while I stood in the doorway to the living room folding a blanket, my elderly neighbor, Marcus, knocked gently and stepped inside. We had been friends for 40 years. He had known my husband, had helped fix the gutters after the storm of '98, had shoveled snow from my walkway every winter whether I asked or not. When he saw my expression, he didn't ask what was wrong. He just nodded once, the way people do when they have already guessed the truth. He leaned in and spoke quietly, as if the walls themselves were listening. "Something is happening in your house, Pat. You need to be careful." When I asked him what he meant, he told me he had seen people coming and going while I was out. Not family, not friends, strangers with luggage, stepping into my home as though it belonged to them. He looked at me with a heaviness that settled deep in my bones. Then he said the words I would not forget. "Wait until midnight. That's when you'll understand." A chill moved through me. I wanted to dismiss him. I wanted to cling to the belief that my son would never allow anything harmful to happen under my roof. But the missing cloth still weighed on my mind, tugging at me like a warning I hadn't yet deciphered. I swallowed hard and nodded. Midnight. I repeated the word slowly, trying to steady myself. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every small sound felt amplified. The settling wood, the refrigerator motor, the faint rustle of someone moving down the hall. At one point, I heard the creak of a floorboard near the guest room and held my breath, listening, afraid of what I might learn if I stood up. Yet something inside me whispered that the time for fear was over. By the time the clock reached 11, I had made a decision. I would not wait passively. I would find out the truth with my own eyes. And if something truly was happening under my roof, I needed to be ready for it. My home was my last real piece of family, the final place where memories of my husband lived without disturbance. I would not let anyone take that from me. As the minute hand moved slowly toward 12, I felt a strange stillness settle inside me. A quiet strength, a sense that whatever waited in the dark would change everything. And I was right. When the clock struck midnight, I finally saw what had been unfolding behind my back. I barely slept after that night. Even when my eyes shut, the house kept moving around me, whispering things I wasn't ready to hear. By morning, the quiet had settled into the walls like a thick fog, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. I moved through the kitchen, touching the counter, the handle of the drawer, the edge of the table, reminding myself that this was my home. My husband's warmth had lived here. My son had grown up here. Yet somehow, I felt like a stranger inside it. I made coffee and stood by the window while the steam curled upward. From there, I could see Marcus in his yard, watering the rose bushes he had coaxed back to life every summer. He glanced over, lifted his hand in a small wave, then returned to the roses with the same slow patience he showed everything. For a moment, I wanted to call him over. I wanted reassurance, a soft truth I could hold on to. But the memory of his warning the night before kept echoing through my mind. Wait until midnight. I wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. At breakfast, Aaron and Melissa joined me at the table. The sunlight drifted in across their faces, but even that warm glow couldn't soften the stiffness between us. Melissa placed her coffee cup down with deliberate care, her nails tapping lightly against the porcelain. She asked about my plans for the day, smiling a little too brightly, as if trying to convince me that everything was fine. Aaron stayed quiet, pushing food around his plate without eating much. I asked whether they wanted to join me for a walk by the river, something we used to do when Aaron was younger. He looked up for a brief second, then shook his head. Melissa answered instead, saying they had errands to run. She didn't specify what kind of errands. I didn't ask. I only noticed the way their eyes met. A quick exchange. A shared understanding that didn't include me. The afternoon passed slowly. I tried reading, but the words blurred. I tried cleaning, but the house felt untouched no matter how much I wiped the counters. The silence pressed in harder. When I opened the living room door, the air felt strangely still, like someone had just rushed out of it. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the room, trying to sense what had changed. Nothing obvious, nothing out of place. And yet the feeling remained. I wasn't imagining this. I knew that much. My instincts had carried me through worse moments in life. They had been right when my husband first fell ill. They had been right when Aaron went through a dark period in his 20s. They were right now, whispering that something was happening just out of sight. By late afternoon, I walked outside to clear my mind. Marcus spotted me and approached slowly, wiping his hands on an old handkerchief. He asked if I was all right, and before I could answer, he leaned closer and said, "People had shown up again earlier that day. 2 women with rolling suitcases, 1 man carrying a duffel bag, all of them walking up my driveway and waiting on the porch until Melissa opened the door." My chest tightened. I tried to steady my breathing, but the image formed too quickly in my mind. Strangers stepping through my doorway while I was out buying groceries or watering the garden. Strangers entering the rooms where my husband and I once danced when no music was playing. Marcus must have seen the panic on my face because he rested a hand gently on my arm. "You're not imagining things," he whispered. "I've lived next door long enough to know when something isn't right." I thanked him and walked back toward the house, though my legs felt heavier with each step. I didn't want to confront Aaron or Melissa, not without understanding what was really going on. A confrontation without truth is chaos, and chaos never leads anywhere good. When I reached the backyard, I ran into Sam, the gardener who had helped me maintain the property for years. He was kneeling near the fence line, pulling weeds from the base of a hydrangea bush. Normally, he greeted me with a bright grin, but that day he stood too quickly and dusted off his gloves like he'd been caught doing something wrong. I asked him how things were going, and he hesitated before answering. Eventually, he admitted that Melissa had changed his work hours. She had asked him to come much earlier some days, much later on others, always when I wasn't home. She didn't give him explanations, only instructions. Then he mentioned something that made my stomach drop. He said he had seen unfamiliar cars parked behind the house on certain nights. He assumed they were friends of the family. But the more he talked, the more I understood that these weren't friendly visits. They were patterns, the kind that grow roots. As he spoke, I felt a cold ache creep into the center of my chest. I thanked him gently, not wanting him to feel responsible for adding weight to my already heavy thoughts. After he left, I stood alone in the yard, staring at the back windows of my own home as if they might confess something if I looked long enough. Later that evening, we had a family dinner. The table was set neatly. The food smelled warm and familiar, but something in the air had changed permanently. Every smile felt thin. Every laugh felt rehearsed. Even the clatter of the silverware sounded muted, as though the house itself was listening instead of living. Melissa talked about a recipe she wanted to try. Aaron mentioned bills he needed to sort out. Their words drifted through the room, but they didn't land anywhere. I watched their faces carefully, searching for traces of the children they once were, for some sign that my fears were wrong. But beneath their polite expressions, I sensed secrets lodged deep, too deep for an easy confession. When dinner ended, I lingered at the table a minute longer. I placed my hand on the wooden surface and closed my eyes. I asked myself the same question I had asked many times in the past few days. Am I losing my mind? Am I seeing danger where there is none? But then I remembered the missing cloth, the strangers with suitcases, the changed work hours, the careful conversations that stopped when I entered the room, and above all, Marcus's quiet, steady voice. Something is happening in your house, Pat. That night, as I turned off the lights and walked toward my room, I felt the house shift again. A soft thump from upstairs, a whisper of movement down the hall. Not loud enough to alarm anyone, but enough to confirm what I already knew deep down. Something was happening, and it was getting closer. The next morning, I woke with a feeling I couldn't shake, as if someone had been standing in the doorway while I slept. The air in my room felt slightly displaced, like a breath had moved across it and vanished before I woke. I sat up slowly, letting my feet touch the floor, and listened. Nothing. Only the familiar hum of the heater and the faint rustle of branches outside. Yet something inside me warned that the quiet was only resting, waiting for me to move so it could stir again. I went downstairs and found Melissa in the kitchen pouring coffee into a travel mug. She startled when she saw me, then covered it with a quick smile that didn't reach her eyes. Aaron walked in a moment later, tying his shoes, avoiding my gaze. They said they were heading out for errands, the same vague answer I'd heard too often lately. When they left, the house exhaled, as though relieved to be empty. So was I. I moved through the rooms carefully, touching surfaces the way someone might touch the cheek of a sleeping child, gentle but alert. I checked the drawers, the cabinets, the doors. Everything looked almost too perfect, as if someone had spent time returning things to their exact places. But that only deepened my worry, because the house had never been this orderly before. Life leaves traces. Family leaves edges. This felt staged. By late afternoon, the sun had started to dip behind the trees, painting long shadows across the yard. I stood at the window, staring at the driveway, waiting for something I couldn't name. That was when I saw it, a car I didn't recognize pulling up to the curb. A young woman stepped out, carrying a small tote bag. She looked around nervously, then walked straight toward my front door. My breath caught. I didn't move. I watched. A moment later, Melissa appeared in the doorway. She stepped outside just far enough to block the view from the street. The woman reached into her bag and handed her something. I leaned closer to the window, trying to see. Bills. A small bundle of them. Cash. Melissa counted quickly, then tucked the money into her jacket pocket. She stepped aside, and the woman slipped inside the house without a word. The door closed softly behind them. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs. I felt heat rise into my face, spreading through my neck and shoulders. I gripped the windowsill until my fingers ached. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't paranoia. I had just seen something with my own eyes that didn't belong in any home, much less mine. This was a transaction. And Melissa didn't look surprised by it. She looked practiced. I stood frozen until the car pulled away again. Then I forced myself to step back, to breathe, to think. I had spent the past week drowning in feelings without evidence. Now I had something real, something solid, something that could not be explained away. But the shock of it didn't resolve anything. It only raised new questions. Who were these people? Why were they paying her? And why were they entering the room that had once belonged to my son when he was a boy? When Aaron and Melissa returned later that evening, I listened from the hallway. I heard footsteps, a few quiet whispers, a door clicking shut upstairs. I waited until the house settled again. Then I went to check the room where the woman had entered earlier. The door was closed. I reached for the knob, expecting the familiar metallic feel of the old lock, but the knob didn't turn. It held firm. I tried again. Nothing. I leaned closer and saw it right away. The lock had been changed. A new one. Shiny edges. Fresh metal. The kind that doesn't belong in a house where everything else is decades old. A cold wave passed through me. They had changed the lock to a room in my own home. Without asking. Without mentioning it. Without reason. I stood in front of that door with my hand still resting on the knob, trying to calm my breathing. My son had once slept in that room. I had read bedtime stories by that window. I had folded tiny shirts and placed them in the drawers, and now I couldn't even open the door. I stepped back slowly. My throat tightened until it hurt. I told myself not to panic, not to jump to conclusions, but the truth was no longer quiet. It was loud. It was clear. And it was standing in front of me in the shape of a locked door I wasn't meant to open. I walked downstairs and sat on the couch, staring at nothing. The minutes passed in long, heavy stretches. I tried to think of reasons that made sense. Melissa wanting privacy, Aaron needing a workspace, anything. But none of those explanations matched what I had seen earlier. Cash exchanged at the door. Strangers arriving with bags. Sam's changed work hours. Marcus's warnings. The missing embroidered cloth. Every piece linked to another. When Aaron came downstairs later, I asked about the lock. My voice stayed steady, though inside my chest a storm was building. He hesitated before answering, glancing toward the stairs as if seeking permission. He mumbled something about repairs and walked away before I could ask anything else. Melissa avoided me entirely, staying in their room with the door shut. After they went to bed, I sat in the dim light of the living room, listening to the faint creaks of footsteps above me. Each sound felt like a reminder that control of my own home was slipping through my fingers. I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to steady the fear rising inside me. Something deeper than worry began to form, something heavier. The sense that this was no longer about small secrets or temporary tensions. This was about something planned, something hidden, something that had already crossed a line. I thought about the woman earlier, the money-changing hands, the closed door, the new lock. My instincts spoke with a certainty I couldn't ignore. If I didn't confront this soon, I might lose more than just peace of mind. I might lose the very home that held my life together. As the clock neared 11, I found myself walking to the window again, staring at the dark driveway. The memory of Marcus's warning echoed through me. Something is happening in your house. I wondered how much he had already seen, and how much he hadn't told me yet. I knew then that watching from the sidelines would not be enough. The truth was moving through my home like a shadow, and shadows grow when left alone. I needed to see everything clearly. I needed proof. I needed to understand exactly what my son and his wife were doing behind that locked door. And deep down, I already knew the next step. I woke the next morning with a decision already forming inside me, firm and unmistakable, the way a tide pulls even before the waves appear. I couldn't keep circling the edges of this mystery. I couldn't wait for answers to fall into my lap. If something was happening in my home, I needed to step outside of it long enough to see the truth clearly. And there was only one way to do that. I needed to disappear without really leaving. I needed to create distance without going anywhere at all. I needed to pretend I was traveling. I sat on the edge of my bed and practiced the idea in my mind, imagining how it might play out. A trip to visit my sister, a few days away. A believable reason, a believable destination. Something that would give Aaron and Melissa enough comfort to let whatever they were doing continue uninterrupted. Something that would let the truth walk out into the open where I could finally see it. When I came downstairs, Melissa was already in the kitchen with her eyes glued to her phone. Aaron stood near the counter stirring a bowl of oatmeal without really looking at it. Their movements were stiff, choreographed, as if each gesture had been rehearsed. I cleared my throat gently. "I might go to Boston for a few days," I said. "My sister's been asking me to visit." Melissa looked up sharply, her expression brightening too quickly. Aaron blinked at me as though unsure whether he had heard correctly. For a moment, neither of them said a word. The silence stretched between us like a tight wire. Then Melissa smiled. "That sounds wonderful. You should go. It'll be good for you." Her eagerness only confirmed what I already suspected. Whatever they didn't want me to see, they would feel freer to do without me walking down the hall or opening a door at the wrong time. I forced a smile, pretending not to notice the relief softening their shoulders. I made a show of preparing for the trip. I brought my old suitcase into the living room, unzipped it, and started folding clothes. I called out the names of things I needed, as if I wanted them to overhear. Warm sweater, extra socks, book for the bus ride. I even walked into the kitchen and asked whether Aaron could drive me to the station the next morning. He hesitated, then quickly said yes. Melissa added that she would help me pack snacks. The more pleasant they became, the colder I felt. Their voices were sweet, light, almost cheerful. But beneath those smiles, I sensed a quiet triumph. They thought I was leaving. They thought the house would be theirs for a while. And whatever they were planning, they believed the coast was clear. After dinner, I carried my suitcase into my bedroom and closed the door. My hands trembled slightly as I zipped it shut again. That suitcase had traveled with my husband and me on long road trips along the coast. It held memories of motels, small towns, and sunsets glowing across water. Tonight, it held only clothes and a fragile piece of my dignity. At 10, there was a soft knock on the door. Aaron peeked in and asked if I needed anything for the morning. I studied his face, searching for the boy I once knew. I found only a tired man carrying secrets he didn't know how to confess. I told him I was fine, and he forced a smile. As he closed the door, I caught a glimpse of Melissa waiting for him at the end of the hallway. She whispered something I couldn't hear. He nodded. They walked away together. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat by the window and watched the moon rise above the rooftops. I tried to calm the shaking inside me by remembering the sound of my husband's voice saying, "We can get through anything." But this wasn't the kind of storm conversation could fix. This required truth, evidence, witness, and someone I trusted. Just after dawn, I rose quietly, dressed, and carried my suitcase down the stairs. I moved slowly, listening for any sign that Aaron or Melissa might be awake. The house creaked as always, but nothing stirred upstairs. When I reached the bottom, I placed the suitcase near the door and waited for the moment to feel right. At 6:30, Aaron came down yawning, rubbing his eyes. "Mom," he said, "are you ready? I'll warm up the car." "I actually called a cab earlier," I lied gently. "They'll be here any minute. You two should rest. I'll be fine." Before he could protest, I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The early morning air was cool and sharp. Aaron lingered behind me, unsure whether to follow. Melissa appeared at the top of the stairs, her hair slightly tousled but her eyes alert. She didn't say anything. She just watched. And then I did exactly what I had planned. I pulled the door closed behind me, walked down the steps with my suitcase, and turned the corner as if heading toward the main road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Not yet. When I was safely out of sight, I changed direction and walked quickly through the side street to Marcus's house. He opened the door before I knocked, as if he had been waiting. His expression held no surprise, only concern, only the steady kindness of a man who had known me long enough to understand what I wasn't saying aloud. "They think I'm out of town," I whispered. "I need to see what happens when I'm gone." Marcus nodded once and stepped aside. "Come in," he said quietly. "We'll watch from here." His house smelled like cedar and old books. The curtains were slightly parted, giving us a perfect view of my back porch and the driveway. Marcus set out a thermos of hot tea, then brought out a pair of binoculars and placed them gently on the table. He didn't ask questions. He didn't judge. He just prepared. As the morning brightened, we sat in silence, watching. Time moved slower in that house, thick and deliberate, like it understood the gravity of what was coming. I tried to breathe evenly, but my hands were restless, brushing against each other as if trying to find steady ground. Around noon, Marcus leaned forward and tapped the edge of the binoculars. "You should know," he said softly. "Midnight is when things change. Fridays especially." His voice carried the same certainty it had the night before. Something inside me tightened. Midnight. That word again. The hour when everything hid itself or revealed itself. The hour I would finally see the truth clearly. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup of tea, trying to calm the trembling. I didn't know what I would find. I didn't know how far things had gone. But I knew this much. Whatever happened in my home when I wasn't supposed to be there, I would see it tonight. And I would not look away. The first hours passed quietly inside Marcus's living room, the kind of quiet that settles into your shoulders and makes every sound feel sharper than it should. I sat beside the window with a notebook resting on my knee, even though I didn't know what I planned to write. Maybe I just needed something to hold, something that felt like control. Outside, my house stood, still in the afternoon light, looking peaceful, harmless, unchanged. Anyone else would have thought it was an ordinary day. But I knew better. Calm can be a mask. Stillness can be a warning. Around 2, a small car pulled into my driveway. A young couple stepped out, each holding a backpack. They looked up at the windows as though checking for movement, then quickly walked to my back door. The woman knocked softly. Within seconds, Melissa appeared, ushered them inside, and closed the door behind her. I felt my stomach twist. "That's the third pair this week," Marcus murmured, writing something down in his own small notebook. "They're always in and out, never staying long enough to be visiting family." I nodded, swallowing the heaviness that kept rising in my throat. I leaned forward and scanned the house. Curtains moved in a window upstairs. A faint light flickered behind the shade. Everything aligned with what I'd been seeing. Short visits, discreet arrivals, strangers stepping into a place that wasn't theirs. My home was becoming something else while I watched from across the yard. 3 more visitors arrived by late afternoon. A man with a small duffel bag. A woman clutching a coat to her chest. Another couple holding hands but not speaking. Each one was greeted by Melissa, never Aaron. Her expression stayed the same every time. A polite smile, calm, practiced efficiency. She moved like this was routine, like she'd done it dozens of times before. Marcus and I began writing down timestamps and short descriptions. At first, my hands shook too much to write neatly, but after a while the shaking settled into a steady rhythm. Recording the truth calmed me. It reminded me I wasn't imagining anything. It gave shape to what had been haunting me for days. At 4:30, the door to the back bedroom opened again. I watched from a distance as Melissa led the young couple out. She walked them toward the porch. speaking softly. I couldn't see her hands clearly, but I saw the movement. A quick exchange, subtle but unmistakable. A small stack of bills slid from her hand to theirs, or perhaps the other way around. I pressed my fingers against my lips, trying to breathe. Marcus whispered, "That looks like payment." I nodded. "Or collection." Outside, the wind shifted, blowing the last of the autumn leaves across the yard. I stared at the pile forming near the fence line and remembered how many seasons my husband and I had spent cleaning this very place. How many times we had laughed while raking, joking about how the trees insisted on giving us more work each year. Standing here now, looking at strangers walk through my home without my permission, that memory felt distant and fragile. As the sun dipped lower, the house grew darker. Lights flicked on inside one by one, creating silhouettes behind the curtains. I leaned closer, trying to make out shapes, patterns, anything that might help me understand exactly how these nights were operating. Around 5, Marcus brought out a folder with lined paper and a calculator. "If we're going to understand this," he said gently, "we need to know what kind of money we're dealing with." I didn't want to think of my home in terms of profit. I didn't want to reduce all the memories inside it to numbers. But part of me knew this mattered. If someone was using my house as a business, it wasn't only a violation of trust. It was theft. And theft carries patterns, schedules, and income. We began by listing each arrival we had seen since I came to Marcus's. We counted how many visitors came the previous week, based on what Marcus had observed himself. Then we roughly estimated what strangers with small bags and hurried expressions might be paying for short stays. Even with conservative guesses, the total made my throat dry. Hundreds per night, thousands per month. Money that someone was collecting inside my home while pretending nothing unusual was happening. I looked down at the numbers, at the notes scattered across the table. "This can't just be about making ends meet," I whispered. "This is organized. This is intentional." Marcus nodded. "And it's been happening for a while." The truth settled over me with the weight of a stone. My embroidered cloth went missing because someone had been in my drawers. The lock was changed because they needed privacy. The silence in the house wasn't emptiness. It was activity being hidden. Everything suddenly aligned into a picture. At 6:30, we saw Melissa step outside again. She carried a small notebook in her hand. She glanced around before walking to the shed behind the house. I felt a chill move down my spine. That shed held old boxes, tools, and the remnants of my husband's projects. It wasn't a place anyone used regularly, not anymore. We watched as she slipped inside. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When she finally emerged, she locked the door behind her and walked quickly back into the house. I wrote down the time, but couldn't steady my hand. That shed had always been my husband's favorite place to escape with his thoughts. Seeing Melissa use it for something secretive felt like another violation layered on top of the ones I already carried. As evening approached, Marcus heated a pot of soup and insisted I eat. I forced down a few spoonfuls, but my mind stayed locked on the house. The lights, the movements, the way shadows shifted behind drawn curtains. Every detail felt like part of a puzzle I needed to solve. Around 8, the flow of visitors slowed. Only one person arrived after that. A middle-aged man carrying a briefcase. He didn't stay long. 15 minutes. When he left, Melissa stood at the door, watching him disappear into the dark. Then she closed the door slowly, as if sealing something behind it. I leaned back in my chair and breathed deeply, trying to organize what we had gathered. Timestamps, faces, exchanges of money, movements in the shed, notes in Melissa's hands. All of it pointed towards something bigger than I had feared. Marcus glanced at the clock. "Tonight will get busier after midnight," he said. "You should rest for a bit." But I couldn't rest. Not when the truth was finally within reach. Not when every piece of evidence pointed towards something I had never imagined possible inside the home I built with love. I stared out the window as darkness fully covered the street. The house looked calm again, but I no longer trusted that calm. Midnight had become a promise, and I knew that when the clock reached 12, whatever was hiding inside those walls would reveal itself completely. Midnight carried a different weight when you were waiting for it, when each passing minute felt like a hinge turning inside your chest. Marcus and I sat near the window with the lights dimmed, watching my house as if it were a stage set for a scene we had not been invited to witness. The street was silent, the kind of silence that anticipates something it cannot name. I held a cup of tea between my palms, letting the warmth ground me. The clock on Marcus's wall ticked steadily, each second a reminder that the moment we feared was creeping closer. I told myself to breathe, but even my breath felt cautious. I knew whatever happened after midnight would either confirm my worst suspicions or reveal something even darker. At 11:30, a car rolled slowly to the curb. Its headlights dimmed before it stopped. A man stepped out, dressed too neatly for a late-night visit, carrying a briefcase pressed close to his side. Marcus raised the binoculars and muttered that he had seen this man before, though never in daylight. My pulse quickened as the man approached the shed behind my house. The shed door opened a few inches before he reached it. Melissa stood inside the doorway, her face half hidden in the shadows. She stepped back to let him enter, glancing around the yard with a nervous precision that confirmed she did not want anyone watching. The man slipped inside, and the door closed with a quiet thud I felt rather than heard. I leaned forward until my forehead nearly touched the glass. The shed had once been my husband's retreat, a place where he kept tools, old memories, and little projects he never had time to finish. Seeing strangers use it for secret meetings made something inside me tighten painfully. Marcus whispered that he had a bad feeling, but he didn't have to tell me. I already felt it crawling through my bones. Minutes dragged by in slow, heavy stretches. No one came out. No one went in. A faint light flickered behind the shed's small window, just enough to illuminate two shadows moving inside. I tried to listen for voices, but the night swallowed every sound. Then, just when I wondered if they planned to stay hidden forever, the door opened again and Melissa stepped out with a folder in her hands. She glanced toward the house, toward the street, and finally toward the yard where Marcus and I sat hidden behind the curtains. She didn't see us, but the caution in her movements told me she sensed the possibility of eyes. She spoke to the man still inside the shed, though her voice was too low to carry. She tapped the folder against her arm, impatient, and waited for him to emerge. When he finally stepped out, he held a pen and a small stack of papers. Melissa leaned closer, pointing at one of the pages as she explained something with sharp gestures. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the tone. It was the tone people use when they feel cornered, when they need something to work in their favor. The man nodded as if reassuring her, though his expression stayed cold. They moved farther into the yard, just within the glow of the porch light. When Melissa handed him the folder, I caught a glimpse of the top sheet. A single word at the heading chilled me. Evaluation. I leaned closer, squinting to make sure I had read it correctly. Evaluation. My name was on the second line. The sight of it sent a tremor through me, sharp enough to bring tears to my eyes. Marcus whispered something, but I barely heard him. All I could see was that folder, the papers inside it, the man holding a pen as if he had already decided my future. My home was being used for secret rentals. But this was something else. This was planning. This was paperwork intended to control me, to shape a story about my life without my knowledge. A cold fear slid through me like ice. The man closed the folder and tucked it beneath his arm. Melissa nodded, satisfied, and they both returned to the shed. The door closed again, swallowing their shapes into darkness. I leaned back with a shudder, gripping the armrest to steady myself. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder and told me I needed to be brave, that the truth was finally stepping out of its hiding place. But courage felt far away. 10 minutes later, the shed door opened once more. The man stepped out first, adjusting his briefcase, and Melissa followed with her arms folded tightly across her chest. They walked toward the driveway, speaking in low tones I strained to hear. A few phrases drifted across the yard, enough to freeze me in place. Something about readiness, something about signing, something about making sure I wouldn't interfere. When they reached the car, the man handed Melissa a small card. She looked at it quickly and slipped it into her pocket. He nodded once before getting inside and driving away, disappearing into the darkness as though the night itself had swallowed him. Melissa lingered on the driveway for a moment, staring toward my house with an expression I couldn't decipher. Then she turned and walked back inside. I sat back, drained, feeling the truth settle inside me with a weight I could barely hold. This wasn't about visitors. This wasn't about short stays or extra money. This was about preparing, something that involved my name, my stability, and my ability to make decisions. Midnight had peeled back its first layer. I knew the next steps would be even harder to face. Yet I stayed by the window, refusing to look away from my home. I knew the night was not finished, that truth would rise again, and that I needed strength to face what came next. Marcus and I stayed by the window long after the man's car disappeared, both of us too stunned to move. The shed sat in the darkness like a sealed secret, holding something it had no right to hold. My heart thudded hard and steady, as if it already knew what I was about to do. I couldn't just watch anymore. I needed to see what they hid in there. I needed proof, real proof, before everything slipped beyond my reach. When Marcus asked if I was sure, I nodded. Certainty had settled into me, calm and cold. The shed had belonged to my husband, a place where he stored his tools and kept pieces of us tucked away in boxes marked with fading ink. If something was being hidden in there now, I had a right to know. We waited until the lights in my house went out one by one, until the yard fell completely silent. Only then did we stand, zip our coats, and step outside. The night air was sharp against my face as we walked across the yard, each step measured, each breath held tight. The grass was damp beneath our feet, and every sound felt louder than it should. I kept glancing at the windows of my house, afraid one might flicker open, but nothing stirred. When we reached the shed door, Marcus pulled a small metal tool from his pocket. He once repaired locks for neighbors during storms, and tonight that skill became something more protective. With a quiet scrape, the old latch gave way and the door eased open. The inside of the shed smelled different than it used to. Gone was the scent of soil and wood shavings. In its place lingered something sterile, faintly chemical, almost metallic. My throat tightened as I stepped inside. A single lantern sat on the workbench, still warm from being used earlier. Papers lay scattered around it, along with a half-filled cup of coffee, a pen, and a thin pair of latex gloves. Someone had been here only minutes ago, planning something in the shadows. Marcus closed the door behind us, leaving only the lantern's weak glow to guide us. He pointed to a metal box sitting beneath the workbench. It was newer than everything else around it. Smooth, dark, locked with a latch that looked too modern for this old shed. My hands shook as I lifted it onto the table. Marcus found a screwdriver and worked the latch until it snapped open. The lid lifted with a slow creak, revealing the inside. Bundles of cash sat neatly wrapped with rubber bands, stacked in rows, each one worn and crumpled from countless hands. Beside the money lay a folder of documents. The first sheet bore my full name. My breath caught. Appointment confirmation. Then another page. Residential usage agreements. Several short-term contracts listing my address. Signed not by me, but by someone forging my name in a shaky imitation. My vision blurred as I kept flipping. Medical notes, typed and stamped, hinting that I had shown signs of confusion. A draft of a power of attorney naming Melissa as the primary decision-maker. My hands went cold. At the bottom of the box lay a small bottle wrapped in tissue paper. A label clung to its side, handwritten. It wasn't a prescription bottle. It wasn't something a doctor would give. My chest tightened as I read the faint words. Just a drop. Helps with cooperation. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to imagine what that meant, but the implication hovered over me like a shadow I couldn't step out of. I closed the bottle quickly, my fingers trembling. Marcus whispered that we needed to take photos. Proof mattered. Memory wasn't enough anymore. I pulled out my phone and snapped picture after picture, and the sound of each shutter felt like a small puncture in the quiet. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but I stayed steady. I forced myself to look at every page because turning away wouldn't protect me. Knowing the truth was the only shield I had left. As I reached for the last stack of papers, a faint sound drifted from outside. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, drawing closer. Marcus froze, his eyes wide in the dim light. The footsteps stopped right outside the shed. My heartbeat thudded so loudly I feared it would give us away. We blew out the lantern and the shed fell into darkness, thick and suffocating. I held my breath, afraid even the smallest exhale would betray our presence. The doorknob turned slightly, testing the latch. My pulse hammered at my ribs. A shadow passed across the small window, blocking what little moonlight seeped in. Someone stood there, listening, searching, waiting. I pressed my back against the wall and prayed that whoever it was would give up. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow shifted away. The footsteps retreated, each one softer than the last. Finally, silence returned, but it felt fragile, as if one wrong movement could shatter it. Marcus touched my arm, urging me to move. We slipped out of the shed into the cold night air, closing the door without letting it latch. Then we hurried across the yard, keeping to the shadows, neither of us speaking until we reached the safety of his porch. When we stepped inside, I finally let out the breath I had been holding. My knees nearly buckled, but Marcus steadied me with a firm hand. Sitting at his kitchen table, I spread the photos across the wood grain. Cash, contracts, my forged signature, the appointment notice, the bottle. The documents lay there like pieces of a story I never agreed to. A story someone had written for me. A story where I lost everything. My voice came out small and thin when I finally spoke. They were planning something far worse than I imagined. Marcus nodded slowly, his jaw tight, his expression full of worry. "You need help," he said. "You can't fight this alone." He was right. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a few strangers renting rooms. It was calculated, organized, dangerous. I could feel the walls closing in, and the only way forward was to find people who understood how to fight what I was facing. I gathered the photos in shaking hands. knowing this was no longer just about fear. This was about survival. And tomorrow, I would take the first step toward reclaiming the life that was slipping from my grasp. Morning light crept across Marcus's kitchen table, spilling over the photographs we had taken the night before. I barely slept, and even when I closed my eyes, the documents from the shed floated behind them like warnings I couldn't escape. As soon as the sun rose, I knew what I had to do. Watching and waiting had brought me the truth, but now I needed protection. I needed someone who understood how to defend people like me, someone who could untangle the lies wrapped around my name. Marcus made coffee and placed the mug in front of me with a quiet steadiness. He didn't speak, but his presence felt like an anchor holding me together. I gathered the photos into a neat stack and slid them into a folder, my hands trembling at the edges. When I looked up, Marcus nodded toward the door. It was time. The longer I waited, the more danger I invited. I took a slow breath and told him I would call Gloria, a lawyer I trusted, someone who had helped a friend of mine years ago during a complicated family matter. Gloria picked up on the second ring. Her voice carried the careful calm of someone who had seen many forms of trouble. I told her I needed to meet urgently, that it involved my home, my safety, and documents I had found that were not supposed to exist. She didn't ask questions over the phone. She simply told me to come to her office right away. I hung up and felt my heart pounding like a drum under my ribs. This was the first step, and the beginning always felt the hardest. Marcus insisted on driving me. As we approached Gloria's office, I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. The moment I stepped inside, she stood from her desk, her expression sharpening instantly at the sight of my face. I handed her the folder, wordless, and she opened it slowly, her eyes scanning each photograph with growing concern. She asked me to start from the beginning, and I told her everything: the strangers, the locked door, the shed, the money, the signatures that were not mine. Every detail poured out like water that had been trapped too long. When I finished, Gloria leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. She told me this was serious, far more serious than anything I had imagined. She explained that if those documents were used, they could strip me of control, shift decision-making into hands that didn't have my interest at heart, and weaken any claim I had over my own home. She said we needed to move quickly, quietly, and precisely. She laid out a plan, step by step, each part more urgent than the last. First, we needed to revoke any authorization that might have been forged or planned. Next, we had to secure a formal statement confirming my full capacity. Then we needed to create a record trail that proved I was aware, alert, and making choices freely. She called a notary she trusted, a man named Thomas who carried a reputation for integrity. He agreed to meet us within the hour. While we waited, Gloria made additional calls, speaking in firm, controlled tones. She contacted a municipal office to request a compliance review of my property. She reached out to a medical professional she trusted to schedule a capacity evaluation for me, one that would be legitimate and beyond dispute. Her efficiency steadied me. For the first time in days, I felt a small thread of safety weaving itself beneath my fear. When Thomas arrived, he greeted me respectfully, glancing briefly at the photos before nodding in understanding. Gloria prepared the documents needed to invalidate any unauthorized attempts that might have been made behind my back. My hands shook as I signed them, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of taking back the ground that had been quietly stolen from me. Thomas stamped each page with deliberate care, sealing them with a sense of finality that felt like a shield being raised. After the signatures were completed, Gloria introduced the next part of the plan. She said we needed more than documents. We needed a clear timeline of what had been happening inside my home. And for that, we required evidence that couldn't be dismissed. That was when she called Javier, a private investigator she had worked with before. She said he had known Aaron years ago, which gave him insight into the situation that could help us understand motives and behaviors. When he arrived, he listened closely, his eyes narrowing when I described the shed meeting and the forged notes. Javier said he could set up audio devices discreetly, ones that would blend into the corners of rooms and gather conversations without drawing suspicion. He explained that people reveal more when they believe they are safe, especially when they think their plans are unfolding smoothly. He assured me that he wouldn't invade private moments unnecessarily, but he would focus on areas where decisions were being made. His voice carried a quiet empathy, the kind that doesn't pity but understands. Before leaving Gloria's office, I asked for a moment to gather myself. I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street below. Cars passed. People walked dogs. Life moved normally for everyone else, yet mine felt like it had been cracked open. Still, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't alone. I wasn't powerless. The truth was on my side, and now I had people who knew how to protect that truth. When we returned to Marcus's house, he insisted I rest while he prepared lunch. I tried, but rest refused to come. My thoughts circled the house across the yard, the visitors, the documents, the shed, the person I had raised who somehow drifted into this darkness. I pressed a hand against my heart and whispered to myself that I would not let fear dictate the next chapter. In the evening, Pastor Hannah stopped by after receiving a quiet message from Marcus. She sat with me at the kitchen table and listened without judgment. She reminded me that protecting myself did not mean abandoning compassion, but compassion without boundaries was a door with no lock. Her words settled into me gently, grounding me in a truth I needed to hold. By nightfall, our plan was in motion. Gloria had the documents, Thomas had the signatures, Javier had the assignments, and I had something I hadn't felt in days. Strength. Not loud strength, but the kind that roots itself deep in your chest and whispers that you can endure what comes next. The day after meeting with Gloria felt heavier than the others, as if the truth I carried had doubled in weight overnight. I woke early, still at Marcus's house, and sat by the window watching a pale morning settle over my yard. Everything looked normal from the outside. The fence, the porch, the empty driveway, yet inside those walls were pieces of a life I didn't recognize anymore, pieces shaped by people I loved, who had made choices I couldn't understand. I thought about Aaron as a boy, running barefoot through the yard with dirt on his knees, proudly handing me that embroidered cloth he made in school. I thought about the way he cried when our dog died, the way he clung to me at my husband's funeral. That boy existed. I knew he did. But somewhere along the way, pressure and fear had pulled him into a version of himself that made my heart ache. Javier arrived just after breakfast, moving quietly so no attention would drift toward Marcus's house. He carried a small bag with equipment inside, and he asked me to walk him through the layout of my home once more. We studied a floor plan Marcus had sketched from memory. Javier pointed to corners near the back hall, the landing, and the den, places where voices tended to travel. He said he had known Aaron when they were younger, working at the same small delivery company. Aaron had been gentle then, reserved, a little too trusting. Hearing that somehow made the present feel even sadder, like something precious had been worn down over time. While Javier reviewed his notes, Marcus stepped out to fetch the mail. When he returned, he handed me an envelope addressed to Aaron. The return address was a bank. The corners of the envelope were bent, as if the letter had been handled too many times before being delivered. I set it aside, but something inside me whispered not to ignore it. Around midday, Javier left to scout the yard and plan his entry later that evening. Marcus and I sat in the living room, both of us quiet. The weight of the last several days had settled between us like a third presence. After a long moment, Marcus cleared his throat and told me that he had heard raised voices coming from my house the night before. He hadn't wanted to upset me then, but he believed it mattered now. I felt a cold ripple move through me as he described what he heard. Aaron and Melissa arguing, not over chores or bills or the things couples often clash about. This argument carried urgency, the kind that grows from fear and desperation. They spoke in sharp tones, words cutting and tumbling over one another. Marcus said he couldn't make out everything, but he did hear Aaron say he couldn't keep doing this. Melissa responded with something that sounded like we don't have a choice. I closed my eyes, letting those words sink in. They didn't excuse anything, but they revealed a pain beneath the surface. Something had cracked open in their lives long before I noticed the first sign. Marcus fell quiet for a long moment, then gently placed a hand on mine. "I know you're hurting," he said softly, "but sometimes the people we love fall apart in ways we can't see until it's too late." His words filled me with a strange mixture of sorrow and understanding. I didn't want to pity Aaron, and I didn't want to justify what Melissa had done. But I couldn't ignore the truth that people don't make choices like these without being pushed to edges they once promised themselves they'd never reach. In the afternoon, while Marcus napped, I returned to the envelope addressed to Aaron. I shouldn't have opened it, but I needed to understand the gravity of what he was facing. Inside was a notice from the bank, the kind that carried deadlines printed in bold letters: overdue payments, final warning, possible foreclosure. My breath hitched. I folded the letter carefully, feeling the pieces fall into place. Pressure, debt, fear. But even that didn't justify risking my safety or my home. Love can understand circumstance, but it cannot excuse harm. When Javier returned in the early evening, he brought something unexpected. He had managed to gather a short audio clip from the edge of the yard while testing his equipment. He played it for me, the sound faint but unmistakable. Melissa's voice first, tight and frustrated. "You said you talked to him." Then Aaron's voice, weighed down by something I hadn't heard in years. I tried so many times." The argument escalated, their voices cracking with exhaustion. At one point, Aaron said something that made my chest ache. "I'm failing at everything." He didn't sound angry. He sounded broken. I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying to hold back the tremble in my chest. Hearing his voice like that cut deeper than any document in the metal box. My son wasn't the mastermind behind this. He was drowning, and Melissa had built a raft made of dangerous decisions. A raft he convinced himself was the only option while he held on with shaking hands. Javier touched my shoulder and said quietly, "People make terrible choices when they're scared, but that doesn't mean you let them sink you with them." I nodded, grateful for his clarity. After listening to the clip, I stepped outside for air. The evening sky stretched above me, soft and bruised with color. I walked a few feet away from Marcus's porch and let the quiet settle into my bones. I thought about my husband, about the nights we used to sit outside with blankets wrapped around our shoulders, talking about Aaron's future. He believed our son would always find his way back to goodness, no matter how rough the road became. I wanted to believe that too. I needed to believe it, but believing didn't mean ignoring danger. When I returned inside, I found Marcus and Javier discussing the timeline of visits and payments. Javier pointed out something that made my stomach twist. Some of the rental names repeated every few days. Some payments were listed under initials that didn't match any guest names. This wasn't a random operation. It had structure, patterns, and people involved beyond my house. That realization settled deep inside me, reminding me how far this had gone. As night fell, I felt a slow shift within myself. I still hurt. I still feared for what might happen next. But the sorrow I carried began to change its shape. It wasn't just fear now. It was determination. My home had become the ground for someone else's chaos. But I wasn't powerless anymore. I had people who believed me, people who understood the danger, people who stood beside me. I sat by the window one last time before bed. My house glowed faintly through the trees. Behind those walls, my son was unraveling, and somehow, I would have to face him soon. Not as the frightened mother I'd been last week, but as a woman who finally knew the full truth. Night settled over the neighborhood with a kind of thick stillness that made every movement feel louder than it was. I sat at Marcus's kitchen table, staring at the small map Javier had drawn of my house, tracing the path I would have to take. Returning home early was part of the plan, but it wasn't the part that frightened me. What frightened me was knowing I would be walking into the center of something that no longer felt like my life. I would be stepping into a house where I no longer knew the rules, no longer recognized the people making them. Javier arrived just before 9 to go over the details again. He said I needed to act normal, to walk in as if my trip had simply ended early, as if nothing troubled me at all. He explained that when people feel safe, they reveal themselves, and that tonight I needed them to feel safe. His voice was calm, but underneath it lay an understanding of how painful this would be. When he handed me a tiny recording device small enough to fit beneath my collar, I hesitated. Not because I doubted its purpose, but because I hated that I needed it at all. Marcus insisted on driving me back. The car rolled slowly toward my house, the headlights brushing against familiar trees, the ones my husband and I planted long ago. The driveway came into view, and my chest tightened. Lights were on in the living room and upstairs hall. Shadows moved behind the curtains. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Marcus touched my hand gently before I stepped out, a silent reminder that I wasn't facing this alone. I walked up the driveway with my suitcase rolling behind me. The sound of its wheels seemed too loud in the quiet night. Before I reached the porch, the door opened. Melissa stood there with surprise painted on her face, but not the warm surprise of someone happy to see me. This expression was thin, alarmed, calculating. "You're home early," she said. Her voice held a half-second delay, as if her mind was scrambling. "Plans changed," I replied lightly. "My sister wasn't feeling well, so I came back." Aaron appeared behind her, his eyes widening when he saw me. He looked tired, more than tired, hollow. I waited for warmth, for relief, for anything resembling the boy I raised, but all I saw was shock. I stepped inside slowly, letting my gaze drift across the room. The air felt thick, as if it carried the residue of a conversation that had ended just moments before. I set my suitcase down, pretending I didn't notice the way Melissa exchanged a look with Aaron, a look full of fear and urgency. "I'm going to go lie down," I said softly. The trip wore me out. They nodded, both too quickly. As I walked down the hall, my eyes caught sight of something small on the kitchen counter. A cloth. Not just any cloth. The embroidered one my son made when he was a child. My throat closed for a moment. It was stained, twisted, and being used beneath a jar of honey, as if it were nothing more than a rag. My breath faltered. The ache that rose inside me was sharp enough to feel physical, a sting across my heart. I paused only a second, then kept walking. The recording device captured every soft footstep and every breath I forced myself to hide. Upstairs, I stopped outside the guest room. No, the locked room now. Voices drifted from the inside. I held my breath and leaned closer, remaining still as stone. Melissa's voice came through first, low but frantic. She wasn't supposed to be back yet. We're out of time. Aaron muttered something I couldn't make out. Then clearly, I told you we needed more days. I told you. My pulse thudded against my ribs. I leaned in just enough for the device to pick up the sound without revealing my presence. Melissa spoke again, her tone sharp. We can't back out now. The appointment is set. He said he'd sign the papers as long as everything looks consistent. We just need her calm, just calm. There was a scraping sound, then glass tapping against wood. We'll give her the coffee at 10, she continued. It will make things easier for everyone. He said mild confusion is enough. The rest we can handle. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself against the wall. They were talking about me, my clarity, my decisions, my life, the person they wanted to convince others I was. Aaron spoke again, voice breaking. I don't want to do this. She's my mother. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the boy he had once been, the boy who used to hold my hand when storms rattled the windows. But Melissa shut it down with a cold whisper. Then think about losing everything. Think about what happens if we don't fix this now. Silence followed, a silence heavy enough to crush something inside me. I stepped back quietly and walked to my room. My hands trembled as I closed the door behind me. I pressed my back against the wood, letting my breath escape in one long, controlled gasp. The recording was enough, more than enough. Enough to reveal intent, planning, danger. Enough to show how far this had gone. When I finally gathered myself, I took a photo of the stained embroidered cloth downstairs. My hands shook as I held the phone, but I needed that image. Not because it proved wrongdoing, but because it captured the moment my heart understood something irreversible. That cloth had survived decades. It had survived moves, storms, time. But it had not survived the people living under my roof. I sat on my bed, allowing the weight of everything to settle over me. Betrayal has a sound. Mine sounded like whispered plans behind a locked door, like the scrape of a chair, like the soft rustle of paper with my name on it. Once the house grew quiet, I slipped out the back door, careful not to wake anyone. I crossed the yard to Marcus's house, each step carrying a mixture of relief and devastation. When he opened the door, the tears finally came. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I handed him the device and the photo. It's enough, he whispered. They can't hide from this anymore. And he was right. Tonight had given me the truth I needed, even if it broke something inside me to hear it. The morning after I returned to Marcus's house felt strangely bright, as if the sun had risen with no knowledge of what had happened the night before. I sat at his kitchen table, gripping a warm mug between my palms, trying to steady the shaking that came and went like waves. The recording lay on the table between us, silent but heavy. Javier arrived just after dawn, and when Marcus replayed the audio for him, his face tightened with a seriousness that confirmed everything I feared. He said quietly that this was no longer just a family problem. It was a situation that demanded witnesses and structure, people willing to speak the truth out loud. I felt exhausted, bruised in places that couldn't be seen. But I also felt a thread of resolve tightening inside me. Last night had shown me more than betrayal. It had shown me the extent of what they were willing to do. And that meant I needed more than legal safeguards. I needed someone neutral, someone outside of my circle of friends, someone whose presence could not be dismissed as bias. That was when the name Helen surfaced in my mind. Helen Brooks had stayed in my home once, months earlier, before any of this had started. She was a retired teacher traveling upstate, kind and soft-spoken. I remembered how Melissa had spoken to her, brushing her off, talking over her, acting as though the house already belonged to her. Something about that memory tugged at me now. So I asked Marcus if he still had Helen's number. He did. She had given it to him after borrowing a rake one afternoon, saying he was the kind of neighbor every town needed. Marcus made the call, and within an hour, Helen knocked on his door, wearing a thick coat and carrying a small notebook. When she stepped inside and saw my expression, her face softened immediately. She reached for my hand gently, as though she already guessed the depth of what had unfolded. I told her I needed to ask about something she had mentioned casually during her stay months before, something I had dismissed at the time, but could not dismiss now. She took a seat and folded her hands over her notebook. "Is this about what she said to me in the hallway?" she asked. My breath caught. What exactly did she say? Helen looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and firmness. She said the house would be there soon, that everything was in motion. She laughed after she said it, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It made me uncomfortable enough that I cut my stay short. The room felt suddenly smaller. Hearing those words from someone who had no reason to lie was like watching the puzzle pieces lock together with an audible click. I thanked her, my voice trembling, and she squeezed my hand in return. I could see sadness in her eyes, the kind people carry when they witness harm they cannot stop. Javier asked Helen a few more questions, noting each answer carefully. She remembered dates, faces, the way Melissa watched her when she walked through the house, the way Aaron avoided eye contact. She also remembered seeing the same young couple arrive with suitcases while she was there, something she had assumed was harmless at the time. That detail alone added strength to the timeline Javier was building. When she finished, Helen reached into her notebook and tore out a page. It held a few lines she had written on the night she left my house, thoughts she didn't want to forget. She had scribbled that something felt wrong in the way Melissa behaved, that the house felt tense, that she sensed secrecy in the air. She had kept those notes out of instinct. Now they became evidence. The moment she placed that page on the table, I felt a swell of emotion rise in my chest. People often speak about community as though it's optional, as though it's decorative, like flowers on a windowsill. But that morning, I felt the full power of what it meant to have community, to have people who stepped forward not because they gained anything, but because they believed the truth mattered. Later in the afternoon, Pastor Hannah stopped by again after hearing from Marcus that things had escalated. She sat beside me on the couch and listened as I tried to explain how it felt to hear my son speak the way he did the night before, torn between guilt and fear, trapped in choices that had swallowed him whole. Her eyes were soft, understanding in a way that made it easier to breathe. She said healing wasn't the same as forgetting, and forgiveness wasn't something owed. But she also said, the heart breaks open not to weaken us, but to make room for clarity. I nodded, trying to hold onto her words. As evening approached, Gloria arrived at Marcus's house carrying 2 thick folders and a look of determination sharp enough to cut through steel. She greeted Helen warmly and took time to review her written notes. She said that Helen's testimony was exactly what we needed, something objective, something clean, something that showed Melissa's intentions before any documents were drafted or any signatures forged. It was proof of mindset, proof of expectation, proof of planning long before any of this started unfolding. Then Gloria outlined the next step. The city inspector needed to see the house exactly as it operated at its busiest. It wasn't enough to show photographs or describe what we'd seen. It needed to be witnessed firsthand, with paperwork and testimony supporting the findings. The inspector would need to catch the operation in action, catch the guests inside, catch the room usage, catch the cash if possible. All of it had to be laid out clearly. Javier studied the schedule we had collected from the past week and pointed to the pattern that appeared over and over. Late evenings, Fridays, the hours after 10. It matched everything Marcus had observed. It matched the receipts, the recordings, and the visitor notes. And it matched the night we were preparing for, the night that would bring everything into the light. Helen volunteered to stand in support during the inspection, saying she wanted to help however she could. Her presence would add weight to what we had already gathered. The more I listened to everyone around me, the more I felt a quiet strength build in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was preparing. As the sky darkened, I walked to the window and looked at my house glowing faintly across the yard. It stood exactly where it always had. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like a place where truth was finally going to stand taller than secrecy. I rested my hand against the cool glass and whispered under my breath, "I'm coming back for what's mine." The night chosen for the inspection felt like the edge of a cliff. Every step we took toward it carried a quiet sense of finality, like the air itself was holding its breath. Gloria had warned us that everything needed to align exactly as planned. The inspector had to see the truth with his own eyes, not through stories or photographs, but through the living reality unfolding inside my home. That meant we needed to be ready the moment he arrived, ready to let the truth reveal itself without interference. By early evening, Marcus's house felt like a small command center. Gloria sat at the table arranging documents into neat stacks. Javier checked his notes again and again, listening to small audio clips that matched the timeline the city needed. Helen sat near the window, hands folded carefully, offering a calm presence that steadied all of us. I sat across from her, trying to quiet my heartbeat, reminding myself that this step wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. It was about reclaiming the peace that had been stolen from me one secret at a time. As the sky darkened, cars began to appear in my driveway. A couple arrived first, then a single man with a backpack, then two women carrying rolling suitcases that bumped softly against the porch steps. Their silhouettes moved across my windows, confirming everything we had documented. The activity built slowly, exactly as Marcus predicted. By 10, the house was alive with quiet movement behind closed curtains. Javier whispered that he would walk ahead to observe and ensure the inspector arrived at the right moment. A few minutes later, he returned with a small nod. "He's on his way," he said. "We have a narrow window. Once he steps inside, the rest will unfold naturally." Gloria turned to me, her voice steady. "You'll join us outside, but you won't step in until after the inspector begins. Your presence isn't required for the initial assessment. It's better that he sees you as the homeowner reacting rather than leading." That instruction settled heavily on my chest, but I understood. This wasn't about demonstrating my pain. It was about showing the truth. And truth speaks more clearly when you don't try to shape it. A car pulled onto the street, headlights slicing through the dark. It stopped by the curb, and a man stepped out holding a clipboard and a municipal badge clipped to his jacket. Inspector Briggs. His posture was firm, his expression unreadable, the type of man who had spent years walking into homes where people insisted nothing was wrong. Javier walked up to him quietly and handed over the preliminary summary Gloria had prepared. The inspector scanned it, tightened his mouth, and nodded once. Then he approached the doorstep of my home. Melissa answered the door, smiling politely, though the corners of her mouth quivered. Aaron stood behind her, shoulders tense, eyes darting toward the hallway. The inspector introduced himself calmly. He stated that a compliance review had been scheduled and that he needed access to the property immediately. For a long second, no one moved. Then Melissa stepped back her beat, voice brittle as she said, "Of course, officer. Come in." From Marcus's yard, hidden near the fence line, I watched everything unfold. The inspector stepped into the living room, scanning the area with a practiced eye. He asked a few basic questions first. How many occupants lived in the house? Whether there were any guests? Whether any rooms were being used temporarily? Melissa answered calmly at first, but her hands fidgeted. Aaron hovered behind her, silent. Then the inspector began his walkthrough. He opened the door to the back hallway. He checked the kitchen, making careful notes. When he climbed the stairs, Melissa tried to follow, but he raised a hand, telling her to wait. She froze at the bottom step, her face paling. A moment later, his voice carried through the open space. "Ma'am," he called down, "I need you to come here." Her steps sounded like reluctant thuds against the wood. When she reached the top, the inspector stepped aside and gestured toward the guest room, the one with the changed lock. The door was open now. Inside, two strangers stood near the bed, startled, holding their belongings. Suitcases lay open. Clothes were scattered. The room had clearly been lived in by people who did not belong. Melissa's breath hitched. She began to explain, but the inspector raised a hand again. "This is an unlicensed rental operation," he said calmly. "Please step back." He recorded the room with his phone, took photographs, gathered statements from the visitors who offered confused explanations about payments and instructions. Helen stepped forward at the perfect moment, telling the inspector what she had heard months ago, including the comment about the house becoming theirs soon. Hearing her speak with clear, steady conviction sent a wave of validation through my chest. Then Gloria approached with her folder, offering him legal evidence, dates, audio transcripts, the timeline that connected every arrival and every transaction. The inspector accepted each piece, flipping through them with a seriousness that made Melissa take an involuntary step back. Aaron stood frozen, his hands shaking at his sides. His face had drained of color. He didn't speak. He didn't defend. His eyes found mine across the yard, but I couldn't read what was behind them. Fear, shame, regret, maybe all three. The inspector placed formal notices on the front door, one for illegal rental activity and another requiring immediate cessation. He explained fines, citations, and follow-up reviews. His tone carried no anger, only authority. But each word landed heavily, like a door closing on a chapter that had been quietly corroding for months. When he finally stepped outside, I walked toward him slowly. My legs felt like they were made of sand. He greeted me respectfully and told me the situation would be handled with full enforcement. He said I had done the right thing by documenting everything. I nodded, though my throat barely let sound through. Behind him, Melissa began pleading with the inspector, her voice cracking in ways I had never heard before. Aaron leaned against the wall, covering his face with his hands. The operation they had built inside my home collapsed right there on the porch, in the presence of people who had come to defend me. Everything I feared had been confirmed. Everything hidden had stepped into the light. As I stood there watching my house return to its truth, I felt no victory, only grief. But also something my heart hadn't felt in a long time: safety. The morning after the inspection felt impossibly quiet, as if the world had paused to absorb everything that had happened. Marcus's house was still, sunlight resting gently on the kitchen counter, but my chest pulsed with a heaviness that refused to lift. I sat at the table with a cup of tea turning cold in my hands, replaying the previous night over and over. The strangers in the room, the notices on the door, the look on Aaron's face. Each memory struck like a small bruise blooming deeper beneath the surface. Gloria arrived around mid-morning, carrying 2 folders marked with colored tabs. Her expression was calm, focused, the way someone looks when they know a storm has passed, but debris still needs to be cleared. She laid the folders on the table, opened the first, and explained what would happen next. The city had already filed reports. Fines were being processed. Property violations would follow. And because the operation involved money exchanged outside legal channels, tax authorities had also been notified. I listened quietly, absorbing each word with a numbness that surprised me. I had expected some relief, maybe even a sense of triumph. But all I felt was a long, slow ache, the kind that starts in the ribs and settles deep in the heart. Gloria then opened the second folder. Inside were 2 letters and a printed report. She pushed one of the letters toward me. It was addressed to Aaron. Another notice from the bank. This one was colder than the last, stating final deadlines, fees, and consequences. The reality of it sank into me like a stone. The pressure he'd been under wasn't mild or temporary. It was crushing. I set the letter down with shaking fingers. Then Gloria unfolded the printed report. It showed a list of medical evaluations under review, including the name of the man who had met Melissa in the shed. There were concerns, she explained gently, about his past conduct, whispers of unethical practices, suspicions of accepting payments for evaluations that favored whoever was signing the check. When she said his name aloud, I felt a chill move through me. The man in the shed wasn't just complicit, he had a history, and Melissa had found him. The weight of that realization settled over me slowly. My home hadn't been invaded by strangers alone. It had been pulled into a chain of decisions involving people who operated in shadows, people who twisted guidelines into tools for exploitation. It hurt more deeply than I expected, because it meant this wasn't simply about desperation. It was about manipulation, about strategy, about taking advantage of a fear they believed I carried. Marcus stepped into the kitchen with an envelope he had picked up from the porch earlier that morning. My name was written on the front in handwriting I recognized instantly. Aaron's. My breath stilled as I stared at it. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Gloria looked at me gently, but she didn't push. She simply waited. When I finally opened it, the letter inside shook lightly in my hands. Aaron's handwriting was uneven, as if written during a night that had broken something inside him. He wrote that he never meant to hurt me, that he had been drowning in debt for months, hiding notices from Melissa and pretending everything was fine. He wrote that when she suggested turning the house into something profitable, he resisted at first. But fear silenced him. Shame kept him quiet. And desperation made him a follower in decisions he didn't fully understand until it was too late. At the end of the letter, he wrote a single sentence that made my throat tighten painfully. I don't know how to be your son anymore, but I'm sorry. I folded the letter slowly, pressing my fingers against the crease to steady myself. Pain and relief mixed inside me until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I didn't condone his choices. I didn't excuse them, but I understood the roots of his fear, and that understanding hurt in its own way. Javier arrived later in the afternoon with updates of his own. He had gone through the ledger pages we recovered from the shed and found entries that didn't match any of the guest names. Payments listed under initials that appeared repeatedly, transfers that didn't align with the timeline inside the house. "This wasn't just a few people using your home," he said quietly. "Some of this money went elsewhere. Someone else was involved." I didn't know whether that made things better or worse. In some ways, it made the picture clearer. Aaron and Melissa were part of something larger than what unfolded in my home. But it also meant this could have grown even more dangerous if it hadn't been stopped. As daylight began to fade, Pastor Hannah arrived with a homemade casserole and a stack of mail she had picked up from the church's outreach box. She sat with me in the living room while the others spoke softly in the kitchen. When she took my hands in hers, I felt a warmth I didn't realize I needed. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer empty comfort. She simply reminded me that strength often reveals itself in the quiet moments after devastation, not during the storm itself. I looked at the photographs spread across the coffee table, evidence from the shed, from the room, from the front door, and beside them sat Aaron's letter. The contrast between the two made something inside me soften and ache all at once. Later that evening, Gloria returned to the table to outline my options moving forward. Civil protections, restraining boundaries, documentation that would prevent anyone from making claims over my decisions again. She explained everything calmly, giving me the space to choose what felt right instead of what felt vengeful. I appreciated that more than she knew. As the sky outside dimmed, I stepped onto Marcus's porch and looked across the yard toward my home. It appeared still again, the way it once had before everything changed. But I knew now that stillness didn't mean safety. Stillness didn't mean peace. Peace had to be rebuilt, piece by piece, with truth laid down first like a foundation. I touched the railing lightly, feeling its familiar texture beneath my palm. Tonight was quieter than the last, but the echoes of everything that had happened still lingered in the air. There was one more step I needed to take. One more conversation waiting for me. A confrontation I could no longer delay. Tomorrow, I would meet with Aaron face to face. Not as the frightened mother I had been, but as the woman who finally understood the full story, broken pieces and all. I woke the next morning with a heaviness that felt different from the days before. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't confusion. It was something quieter, something resolute, like the moment a tide pulls back just before breaking into a wave. I knew what I had to do. I had read Aaron's letter more times than I wanted to admit, each time feeling the words settle deeper into the hollow places inside me. There was no avoiding it anymore. I needed to look my son in the eyes. I needed to hear his voice without walls, without shadows, without the noise of everything Melissa had woven around him. Marcus offered to drive me, but I asked him not to. Some steps a mother has to take alone, even when they hurt. So I walked. The air was cool, the kind of cool that nudges old memories awake. As I reached the edge of town, I saw him standing beside his car in the far corner of the grocery store parking lot, exactly where we agreed to meet. His posture was slumped, hands shoved into his pockets, shoulders drawn inward. When he lifted his head and saw me, something flickered across his face. Guilt, relief, dread, or maybe all three tangled together. I approached slowly, my feet heavy on the pavement. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Wind rustled the leaves near the curb, and the distant sound of shopping carts clattered across the asphalt. When I finally stopped in front of him, Aaron looked down at the ground, as if he couldn't bear the idea of meeting my eyes. "Mom," he whispered. His voice cracked on the single word. I nodded, swallowing the tightness rising in my throat. Thank you for meeting me. He exhaled shakily, still staring at the pavement. I didn't know what else to do. After last night, after the inspector. His words trailed off, lost somewhere between shame and regret. I waited, giving him the space to find them again. When he finally looked up, his face was raw, unguarded. I'm sorry, he said. I'm so sorry for everything. Hearing those words didn't erase the hurt, but they reached a part of me I had been trying to keep still. I let the silence settle between us for a long moment. Then I asked softly, tell me the truth. All of it. I need to understand how we got here. Aaron nodded slowly. His hands trembled as he pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. It wasn't a notice, not another unpaid bill. It was a letter, older, worn at the edges. He held it out to me with hesitation. I wrote this months ago, he said quietly. Before everything got bad. Before Melissa started pushing the idea of using the house. I never sent it. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I looked at him and waited. He ran a hand through his hair and took a shaky breath. I was drowning, Mom. I kept trying to fix things on my own, but every time I caught up on one payment, another came in. I didn't want you to see me like that. I didn't want you to think I had failed. My heart tightened, remembering the boy who used to bring me his broken toys so I could help him mend them. Somewhere along the line, he decided I could no longer be the person who helped him put things back together. He continued, voice trembling. When Melissa brought up the idea of renting, I didn't think it would go this far. It was supposed to be temporary, just until we caught up. But then she said there were bigger opportunities, that we could stabilize everything if we just committed. After that, everything spiraled. A long pause followed. Then his voice dropped lower. I didn't know about the paperwork at first. When I found out, I panicked. I told her I didn't want to do anything to you, that I couldn't. But she was scared too, and she said we had no other way out. I let fear make decisions for me. I let her lead, even when I knew it was wrong. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, ashamed. I hurt you. I betrayed the one person who's always been in my corner. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even deserve it. The ache in my chest deepened, sharp but steady. I stepped closer, watching the way he flinched slightly, as if expecting anger. But anger wasn't what rose inside me, just sadness. Deep, bone-heavy sadness. You broke my heart, I said softly. You cracked something I didn't think could ever break between us. He nodded hard, swallowing tears. I know. But, I continued, I also know what fear can do to people, what pressure can turn them into. None of that excuses what happened. None of it makes the choices right. But I see the pain behind them. He covered his face with both hands. I don't know how to fix any of this. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope I had prepared earlier. I pressed it gently into his hand. He looked at it with confusion. What is this? It's help, I said quietly. Not a clean slate. Not freedom from consequences, but a beginning. A chance to stand on your own feet without dragging me down with you. He hesitated, tears welling again. Mom, I don't deserve this. No, I said. But this isn't about deserving. It's about choosing what comes next. He opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a small amount of money, enough to help him take his first steps, not enough to erase the mess he had made. And a note, handwritten in simple words. Begin here. When he read it, His knees seemed to give slightly, and he leaned against the car for support. His voice broke in a way that made my own breath catch. "I'm so sorry," he whispered again. I touched his arm gently. "I'm not forgiving you today. Maybe not for a long time, but I'm giving you the chance to be someone worth forgiving." For a moment, we stood there in the soft morning light, mother and son, both broken in different ways, both trying to find the first step towards something resembling healing. When I finally turned to leave, Marcus waited in the distance, watching quietly to make sure I wasn't alone. I walked toward him with slow steps, feeling the heaviness inside me shift. Not gone, but changed. Tomorrow, I would return to my home. Tomorrow, I would reclaim everything that had been taken from me. The next morning arrived with a softness that felt almost unreal, as if the world had decided to grant me one small, merciful breath before asking me to begin again. I stood on Marcus's porch with my hand resting on the railing, staring across the yard at my house. The sunlight fell against the windows gently, revealing a familiar outline that had once brought me comfort. Today, it felt like both a promise and a challenge. I knew stepping inside would stir everything that had happened, but I also knew I couldn't live in the shadow of fear anymore. It was time to reclaim what was mine. Marcus walked beside me as I crossed the yard, staying silent in the steady way he always had. When we reached the back steps, I paused, letting my hand hover above the doorknob. So many things had passed through this threshold: joy, sorrow, secrets. For a moment, my eyes stung with tears I wasn't ready to shed. Then I took a slow breath, turned the knob, and stepped inside. The air smelled of vanilla candles, the ones I used to light in the evenings, but beneath it lingered the faint echo of strangers, the residue of nights I couldn't erase. I walked through the living room slowly, touching the back of the couch, the edge of the bookshelf, the frame of an old picture. Each touch grounded me. Each touch whispered that I had survived something heavier than I'd ever expected to carry. Marcus stayed near the front door while I moved deeper into the house. The embroidered cloth was still on the kitchen counter, stained and wrinkled. I picked it up gently, letting the fabric rest across my palms. For a long time, I simply held it, remembering the small hands that stitched the tiny crooked flowers, the proud smile Aaron had worn the day he gave it to me. The stain no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a reminder of everything broken, yes, but also everything that could be mended. I carried the cloth into the hallway and made my way toward the master bedroom. The room looked untouched, as if time had paused inside it. I stood in the doorway, imagining my husband brushing sawdust off his sleeves, laughing at something trivial, looking at me with the kind of love that made every hardship easier to bear. I whispered his name softly, letting the sound settle into the floorboards. It felt like a blessing, gentle and familiar. With slow steps, I opened the closet and took out the small easel we kept tucked away, the one he bought for me when we promised to find new hobbies after retirement. I carried it into the room and set it by the window where the sunlight fell brightest. Then I opened a drawer and pulled out my old paints, the ones I had almost thrown away years ago because life had grown too busy to use them. Today, I needed them. I needed color again. I unfolded the embroidered cloth and draped it over the corner of the easel as a quiet anchor. Then I placed a blank canvas on the stand. The empty space felt hopeful, like a doorway into a version of myself I had forgotten but never truly lost. I held a brush in my hand for a long moment before dipping it into the paint and letting the first stroke glide across the canvas. The gentle scratch of bristles meeting fabric echoed softly through the room. It was the sound of reclaiming something piece by piece. While I painted, Marcus moved quietly around the house, opening curtains, letting light spill into every room. I could hear the faint creak of windows sliding upward and the sound of dust being brushed aside. It reminded me of spring cleaning mornings when my husband would whistle off-key as he swept the porch. For the first time in weeks, the house felt like itself again. Not perfect, not untouched, but alive. Later in the afternoon, Gloria arrived with a stack of documents and a reassurance that everything had been legally secured. No one could question my decisions. No one could make claims on my behalf again. She walked through the house with me, explaining each paper carefully, her voice steady and confident. When she finished, she touched my arm gently. "You did everything right," she said. "You protected yourself and your home." Pastor Hannah visited shortly after, carrying a small potted plant she said symbolized resilience. She placed it by the kitchen window and smiled warmly, telling me she believed the hardest part was behind me. She prayed with me quietly, her words soft and soothing, reminding me that healing often grows in the places we least expect. Sam stopped by as well, offering to help fix the shed door and replace the lock. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry, just rolled up his sleeves and got to work, giving the yard a sense of order again. Watching him move around the garden brought a simple comfort to my chest. Life was finding its rhythm. As evening approached, the house filled with a stillness that no longer frightened me. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the doorknobs, the familiar creases in the floorboards. Everything felt different, yet exactly the same. It was my home again, not because nothing had happened within its walls, but because I chose to stand inside them despite everything. When I returned to the master bedroom, the painting on the easel had taken shape. Soft strokes of green and gold forming the beginnings of a garden scene I used to imagine planting with my husband. I added a final stroke of color and stepped back, letting the moment sink in. The embroidered cloth fluttered gently on the corner of the easel, catching the last glow of the setting sun. I felt a quiet warmth bloom in my chest, a warmth shaped by truth, by community, by courage I didn't know I had until I needed it. As the light faded, I whispered to myself the words that had carried me through the darkest nights. I pretended to visit my sister because something felt wrong in my house. And when the clock struck 12, I finally saw everything. But what matters most is what I chose to see when the sun came up again. My home, my strength, and the person I refused to lose in the process. I picked up my brush one last time and set it gently in the jar. Then I closed my eyes and let the quiet sink into me, not as a warning this time, but as peace, my peace. The house was mine again, and so was I.